And we've got a treat for you this evening. Really looking forward to this one. Former Conservative MP for 36 years, a formidable backbencher and grandson of Sir Winston Churchill. Welcome to Times Radio, Sir Nicholas Soames.
Good evening, Kate.
Good evening to you.
Or good morning, rather.
Yes, it is. How do we find you this evening, tonight, then, Sir Nicholas?
Well, shaken but not stirred. You know, I'm like everyone else. Pretty jarred off with lockdown. It's a difficult time for everyone, and the quicker we can all get out of it, and the quicker that everyone, I think, conforms in the next 2 weeks, because we really all have to put our faces to the grindstone in the next couple of weeks so we can all get out at the beginning of December and hopefully join up with all our families over Christmas.
You're no longer an MP, but if you were, would you be even more frustrated, do you think?
Well, I think being an MP you live in a permanent state of frustration with whichever government is in power. But I think it's very tough, actually. I can't put myself in the feet of serving members of Parliament at the moment, but it must be very, very difficult. And, the parliamentary party is split in many ways, and understandably so. You know, these are huge issues touching on personal liberty and disease and, areas that members of Parliament are not used to having to deal with at a time when our nation is in the middle of some very, very difficult talks on our leaving the European Union. It's not an easy time, and it must be very frustrating to sit as one does as a government party and finding perhaps you can't agree with the government on certain very big issues. That's a very difficult time. I know, I've been through it.
Yeah, for many, many years as well. You came out and criticised Boris Johnson's cabinet in August of this year. The quote I've got here is that you called them dismal. And that you weren't a huge fan of how the pandemic was being handled. We are in lockdown now. That may have eased some of your concerns, but just take us back through that quote, through your criticism of Boris Johnson's cabinet earlier this year, and whether that criticism still stands.
Look, first of all, when this government was elected, it was elected with a mandate. Albeit, in my view, a dismal mandate, but it was elected with a mandate and it gained a huge majority. So technically, it was right and I was wrong. But then it got hijacked by this terrible, terrible COVID virus with the attendant tragic loss and the gross impairment of the economy and everything else. So I think it's a very, very difficult time. My remarks about the cabinet really are this, that I believe that Boris Johnson chose his cabinet full of people whose only requirement really was that they would support the Prime Minister in these Brexit talks, come hell or high water. And therefore, I think it is actually a very mediocre cabinet. I think there are some very good people there. There are some very good people there. But basically, I think it's a cabinet that was chosen for an entirely different reason. And they have, they've been faced with the most serious position any government in this country has found itself in since 1945. So they get a bit of a hospital pass in one way or another. But I actually think, by and large, this is not a cabinet that was chosen for talent.
Yeah. Elaborate for us a little bit. Who could have done better? I mean, you've got figures in there like Matt Hancock, desperately trying to handle the pandemic, Gavin Williamson looking after the education side of it. Who do you think could have done better?
Look, Kate, I really don't want to be tempted down the path of being impertinent and beastly about people who were my friends. But I actually think that a good example is Matt Hancock, who actually, I think, considering the unbelievable difficulty and complexity of the job that he has to do, I think has done pretty well. Look, Captain Hindsight, as the Prime Minister correctly has regularly called the leader of the opposition, is a very, very easy place to be. And I don't think I don't think it would be right to criticise the Secretary of State, the Health's handling of this. I think he's done a very good job. I think the whole government has done as well as it possibly can. But I must say this, and I mean, I think that it's an extraordinary thing that when the government last wrote a list of the most serious threats this country faced, a pandemic was right at the very top of that list. I'm not sure it was actually first on the list, but it was certainly in the top three. And the trouble is that no one, and this will have to be thoroughly investigated in the inquiry, no one ever took that really seriously.
Mm.
And the fact is that, this was all, I mean, there were siren voices that I didn't listen to. I mean, I don't hold myself out as any example on this at all. But, I remember I was Secretary of State. I was Secretary of State, I wish. I was Minister of State for the Armed Forces. And I remember the pandemic threat, even in those days, 20 years ago, being signalled. But in the last Defence Review, it was much higher up the list. And yet no one did anything about it. And I think the public will rightly want to know why that was the case. And I don't blame this government in particular. But the trouble is that Brexit and the whole Brexit campaign has kind of hijacked government in this country.
Yeah.
And the knock-on effect from that is the situation that you have seen in the last few days, where inevitably the weaknesses of government by campaign have been lethally and toxically exposed. And the Prime Minister now is in a position where he's in the middle of a great crisis, and he mustn't let it go to waste.
There is a chance to reset with Dominic Cummings and Kane gone. Describe to me your experience of both gentlemen. Were they an asset, or were they not of great benefit to Boris Johnson?
I've never met Kane. I know absolutely nothing about him, and I'm not surprised to hear that he dressed up as a chicken to chase David Cameron about during election. It doesn't sound to me like a great figure at all. Dominic Cummings, I know nothing. I don't know him. I've met him once. And funnily enough, I met him on the day that I was dismissed by the Prime Minister with 20 others from the Tory party in the anteroom to the Cabinet room at number 10, when I saw this very dismally dressed young man hanging around with who no one was talking to. So I recognised him as Dominic Cummings and went up and introduced myself to him, saying that we had I knew his father-in-law, which I do, and we had a perfectly civil conversation. I'm not knowing that he was the architect, together with the Prime Minister, of sacking me and 20 others from the membership of the Tory party. Now, the Prime Minister was good enough to reinstate me just before the general election, but nevertheless, I can't say that he's my favourite flavour of the month. Not because of what he's done to me. He's undoubtedly a brilliantly capable, brilliantly clever, able campaigner. But he is not a man to have, in my view, a huge influence on the way that the government actually governs. And I think we've run into a confusion between campaigning and governing.
Yes. And also,
so I'm not sorry that Dominic Cummings is gone. I'm sorry that I'm sorry for his wife and family, but I'm not sorry for him personally. I think he really had become a figure who dominated number 10, became the news, not the government. He became the news. He became the story. And to be absolutely frank, government is not about beating absolutely everyone up, including the cabinet. And his disrespect for Parliament, for members of Parliament, and in particular for ministers, was legendary. And I'm afraid that I can't believe that kind of behaviour is acceptable in good government. Indeed, I read in the papers today that Mark Sedwill, then the head of the civil service and a really wonderful man in my view, was at a meeting at number 10 and actually asked Dominic Cummings, where are the ministers? And the fact is he completely bypassed the system. And I think that it's a measure of the weakness of this cabinet, the weakness of the system. And I'm afraid to say that the Prime Minister went along with this. And I hope that he will not now let this thing go to waste, and that he will now reset and reset in the kind of good Boris. And there is a good Boris. The good Boris was Mayor of London, was a proper One Nation Tory, will have regard, of course, to the interests of the Red Wall. And I think the suggestion that it was only because of Dominic Cummings and Kane that the government of this country realised that levelling up was an essential policy. It's always been an essential policy. And I'm glad to say that the Prime Minister ran a brilliant campaign with Dominic Cummings, which led to a big majority of 80 seats, and certainly he's got to honour those obligations. He'll do it without Dominic Cummings.
Do you think Dominic Cummings disrespected the system, disrespected how government and how Parliament worked because he wasn't an elected official?
I think he grossly disrespected it. Look, no one's pretending that, as a collective group, all members of Parliament are perfect and wonderful and brilliant and all the rest of it, but he despised Parliament. He despised members of Parliament. He despised ministers. And most of all, he hated civil servants who stood in his way. That is not the way to govern this country. It is not the way we do things. I'm sorry. And no one's denying that there's not great room for improvement in the quality and way in which our civil service operates. And I mean, I have the greatest respect for our civil servants and our civil service, at all levels. But, there's no denying that we need to do a lot of things better than we do. And he was right about that. In order to do that, you don't have to beat the living daylights out of everyone, disrespect them, and make this a toxic, unpleasant, beastly place to work.
Was he, by asking for weirdos and misfits to apply for the civil service, was he trying to level up? Was he trying to make the civil service more accessible for all? Was he trying to get some different personalities in there?
No, and it was an unbelievably foolish, stupid advert. I mean, what we want in the civil service is experienced, good, pragmatic, sensible people who will get on with delivering the government's policy. Now, look, I'm not here to be an advocate for Britain's civil service, other than the fact that many other countries in the world would pay good money to have a civil service like we have. It is disinterested, it's apolitical, it serves the next government as well as it does the last government. It has all sorts of qualities that are of vital importance to good quality. But there are all sorts of things that we really do need to do much better, and there is room within the civil service for great improvement, but not in the way, in my view, that Dominic Cummings did it. I mean, he the whole way that he went about it was absolutely, in my view, guaranteed to mean that people don't work well for you. I mean, I was a soldier, and I was taught about leadership at a very early stage. And one of the things you learn, that leadership is not inhumane, it's not beastly. It's leading by example, by empathy, by integrity, by authenticity, all the things that we know go towards making a good leader. It is not made by people flailing with a big sledgehammer.
Dominic Cummings could argue that he was only carrying out the responsibilities expected of him from Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was the person who hired him, who brought him in. So how much of this needs to be levelled at Boris Johnson and his decision-making?
Look, I think that the position is quite clear. I think that the Prime Minister has, for very good reason, decided to dispense with the services of Dominic Cummings and Mr. Kane. And I think you should leave it at, frankly, I'm content to leave it at that. And I think, as you said at the beginning of this, it is the time, it is possible now to have a reset. And the reset, I hope, will show, one thing I do think is it's not about being nice to people. You don't have to be sort of frightened to go around wearing sort of carpet slippers and being fluffy about it all. I'm not asking to like anyone. I just want them to do it really well. And it's quite clear that what was going on was not being done really well. And there was terrible toxicity and infighting and all the rest of it because it was entirely ideologically driven. And government, do you know something? Government isn't really about ideology. It's about pragmatism and reality. but never losing the sight of where you want to go. And I think they lost sight of where they wanted to go. I think this was all about Brexit and not nearly enough about good government.
In terms of Brexit, we must speak to you about this because, of course, you and 20 other rebel Conservative MPs voted against the Conservative government of Boris Johnson to pass a motion allowing backbenchers to take control of the House of Commons in order to pass a bill to stop a no-deal exit from the EU without parliamentary approval. You're still vehemently against a no-deal exit. What do you make of the situation we're in right now?
I think we're in a very, very difficult situation. And I don't think this is all Britain's fault. I think the negotiations have been very fraught. I think Britain has done very little, frankly, to get a deal done. I think that the 26 are very difficult to negotiate with. I think Michel Barnier has taken a very clear line, which has been quite clear since the beginning. And unless both sides move, there will not be a deal. Now, the deal as it stands at the moment is what is politely called a skinny deal. That means to say it's a deal, absolutely mere deal. And whatever happens, in my humble opinion, we are going to end up on the wrong side of the coin. And if we think we're going to be rescued by a trade deal with America or a trade deal with Japan or this and the other, well, I would like to have big trade deals with all of them. But, the United States of America does 16% of its entire trade with the European Union and 5% with the United Kingdom. And I don't think that puts us in a very strong place. And there are many other figures in the same way. Now, I'm not fighting yesterday's battle. I accept that the referendum result must be honoured. And I accept that we have left the European Union, deeply though I regret it.
Yeah.
But I think we're leaving it on, at the moment, on very bad terms, very disadvantageous terms. And I'm afraid that if it wasn't for the damage that the COVID has done to the economy, and that is not the fault of the Prime Minister and the government, that is just the way it's been because of the terrible effect that COVID has had on our economy, the costs of Brexit are likely to appear literally below the line as a footnote. And yet the long-term damage, in my view, to the financial security of this country is going to be profound. And that is not anything, that is not without the very grave damage that is being done to our position in the world, which is, to my mind, very, very serious indeed. And I think people are going to be deeply shocked when they find that we are no longer going to be as relevant as we were on the world stage. And that is a deep sadness to me.
What happens if we're to put this very simply, to be very clear, what happens if the UK leaves without an adequate deal, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I think it'll be deeply economically damaging. Everyone goes on about how marvellous the WTO is. WTO terms will be, we'll be able to manage it, but it'll be deeply damaging to the economy. It's going to be absolutely chaotic. It's quite clear that although the government have been trying to get people to be aware of the situation, that not nearly enough people truly understand the consequences of what that means. And in particular, if you look in the last few days to the question of the transport industry and the problem with Northern Ireland and elsewhere, the consequences are going to be very serious indeed. It's going to be absolutely chaotic. Now, if people who voted to leave Brexit, they voted for their own good reasons, and I do not in any way disrespect this, but I'm not sure that they were entirely aware of the consequences that are going to ensue. I don't believe that sovereignty in the world we live in today is absolutely everything. I think we live in a multilateral world, and that is why it's such a marvelous result, in my view, that Senator Biden, President-elect Biden, won the American election, because he will restore and I think re-establish the multilateral relationships, which are vitally important to the way our country has always operated. But we're going to be operating like a sort of, we've got a leg down, we've got a bullet in one leg. And I think we're going to find it very, very difficult to make our way in the world. And I don't think people have the information or the desire to think through those kinds of things. And I don't say that as a patronizing way. Why should they? I was talking to someone this morning, actually, who said, well, I'm a Brexiteer, and I probably didn't think through the consequences. I just wanted to leave the European Union. And that, frankly, is the wrong way to do it, in my view. But that's what's happened to our country, because for 40 years, no one has ever properly made the case for the European Union, ever, consistently, all the time. And the Brexiteers have had the best song, the best music, the best tunes, and all the rest of it for the last 40 years. And the consequences are going to be reaped now.
In your actions of trying to stop a no-deal exit, trying to block Boris Johnson's Brexit plan back in September last year, the whip was removed. Have you forgiven Boris Johnson for removing the whip from you?
Look, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister was entirely entitled to remove the whip from those who did not agree with what he was doing and would not be persuaded to go along with it. He was entitled to do that. And so, of course, I forgive him because he was the Prime Minister and he was entitled to do it. I think it was a bad decision. And whilst I'm not claiming, it will not be for the 21 of us to claim that we were right and everyone else was wrong. Of course not. But I think on this particular argument, which was a matter of principle, I felt I could not support the government. I could not support the Prime Minister, which I deeply regretted. I could not support them on this, which was, for me, the biggest decision that had to be taken short of going to war in 36 years in Parliament.
Boris Johnson will eventually, when he becomes President of the United States, be dealing with Joe Biden and his Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, Joe Biden was said to be incensed when Johnson, in an article in The Sun in 2016, implied that Barack Obama had removed a bust of your grandfather, Winston Churchill, from the Oval Office on purpose. And Johnson used some, quite frankly, quite racist language in the article that he wrote. It transpires that the bust was removed because it was being loaned to a museum or an exhibition. It was all above board. There was nothing personal in it at all. Do you think there's going to be any hangover of that? Do you think Biden's going to remember that at all? Because that won't have been an entirely pleasant first dealing with Boris Johnson.
Look, first of all, whether or not the President of the United States of America has a bust of my grandfather in their study is not a matter of world importance. It's very nice for us in Britain to think that the Americans think so highly of Churchill and his reputation and his importance to what we call a special relationship, to what they call one of the very special relationships they have. I don't think that's of profound importance one way or the other, although I'm sure that the Prime Minister, with hindsight, will wish that he hadn't said it. But I don't think that's going to affect the future. I think it's more likely that he will find he'll have to earn his time with Kamala Harris. But Joe Biden has been chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee at the Senate for many years, is a very long-standing Atlanticist, is a real politician, a real politique. He understands very clearly, and I think all that will be just fine. But, and you know, we have a very important hand to play with America. And I think the Prime Minister is uniquely placed, actually, to make the very best of this. You know, the G7 in London, the COP26 talks in London, there is nothing more important to us and, you know, very important to America that these talks are a great success. So I think there are firm foundations, albeit with a bit of a bumpy start. There are firm foundations to build a very solid relationship between the President of the United States and this country with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. And now that we've all recovered from the tremendous collective nervous breakdown we all seem to have about who gets which the first telephone call, which, honestly is just such a sort of joke, completely absurd charade that goes on every time. And if you talk to anyone, which you will have done, Kate, of the several ambassadors to the United States, like Sir Peter Westmacott or many others, they will tell you that this special relationship is something that we wear around our neck like an albatross. We have a very, very solid, very important relationship, absolutely prime relationship with the United States, based on military, security, intelligence, cultural, investment, business, everything else that really is probably outmatched by almost any other nation on earth. But America has very special relationships with lots of countries. Of course it does. It's the most powerful nation in the world. And I hope that President-elect Biden will be able to undo the terrible damage that President Trump has done to that scheme relation, not just for the sake of everyone else, but for the sake of America, whose position in the world has become, in my view, not powerless because it's so powerful, but has become so misunderstood and so difficult for many countries to operate with. So I'm full of hope, actually, about the Biden-Johnson relationship, the Biden-UK relationship, not because he loves Boris or Boris loves him, but because they both understand that we all mind about the same things, and there are historic opportunities ahead of us to take this relationship and the good that it can do forward in a big way in the next year.
You're listening to Times Radio. Kait Borsay with you here. We're joined by Sir Nicholas Soames, who was an MP for many, many years. An opposition to Brexit, he had the whip removed temporarily, no longer a standing MP, but has such fascinating and interesting views that we've been enjoying listening to this evening. I did want to ask you about your grandfather, Winston Churchill, and the fact that he has really entered into the debate that's been going on in light of the Black Lives Matter movement about the suggestion that certain parts of British history, like statues of your grandfather, for example, should be contextualised for the modern day, should be reviewed. And we heard from the Imperial War Museum not more than a week ago that it is going to look at your grandfather's legacy. It's going to be reviewed. They don't want to reinterpret it, but they do want to look at it. What's your response to that and the general line on whether it's appropriate or not to remember British history as it was, as it happened, or whether it does need to be contextualised for the modern day?
Look, Kate, I don't want to sound on your programme like some frightful pompous old git who doesn't understand that life has moved on. And in many ways, in respect of this, I don't understand it. I don't understand the language, and I don't understand what they're really trying to do. Churchill grew up. Churchill served 6 of the kings and queens of Great Britain. He was commissioned from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst as an officer in the British Army in the reign of Queen Victoria, and he ended up as the present Queen's first Prime Minister. And that is a length of telescope of history which covers a vast amount of Britain's life over a long period of time. And naturally, when he was a young man in Edwardian Victorian Britain, he spoke the language of Edwardian and Victorian Britain. And he had the attitudes of an Edwardian in many ways. Of course he did, because he was colonial secretary, for example. And he travelled about our empire, the Great British Empire, of which we have, in my view, nothing to be ashamed of. It's just part of our history, and a very important part of our history, as a minister in the Queen and the King's government. And of course, he dealt with those people that he dealt with in those countries that he dealt with on the basis of Britain's imperial might and power. And so naturally, when you come to look at Churchill's history, he is an Edwardian, a Victorian, Edwardian, Georgian, and Elizabethan figure. He covers a huge amount of ground.
But then
and so
does that
important. Sorry.
does that then need to be contextualized? Do we need to respect what the opinion was at the time? How, in the modern day there were opinions and there were actions that could be deemed as racist, as colonialist. There's criticism of your grandfather for the way he conducted his response to the Bengal famine. His statue has been defaced. Do we need to respect history but put a disclaimer with it? How do we deal with it?
Well, actually, you're quite right, Kate. Of course, it's not a disclaimer, but I think it's right that in an age when I'm afraid so few people are taught any proper history, that unless they are to understand what truly happened and the circumstances and the time at which they happened, they won't understand. So providing one does this in a sensible and pragmatic way, it's fine. But if it's to become a sort of woke campaign, well, then I think that's absolutely idiotic. And I don't understand why the Imperial War Museum, who after all derive immense benefit from the Churchill war rooms, which they own and run, and I have a great regard for the Imperial War Museum, by the way. I think they're a wonderful organisation, but they rarely feel it essential that they have to sort of descend to the lowest common denominator and the spirit of the hour to find themselves necessary to explain Churchill. But what is truly shocking, Kate, is if you go to I haven't been a member of Parliament now for some time, but I remember going to a school in someone else's constituency who asked me to go and spend the day with them and to talk about my grandfather. I asked the question to them, how many of you know of Churchill? And only about 20% of the people in the classroom put their hand up. So it's right, I think, that people should have the ability to understand the history, but to explain it not in a sort of politically woke way, but to explain it in a completely matter-of-fact way. We do not have to apologize for our history. We do not have to apologize for our history, but it's probably right that we should explain it and the way in which it happened and the times in which it happened.
I'll leave it there because we've sadly run out of time, but I could carry on talking to you for a long time indeed. I haven't got through half of my questions, but you're a formidable talker. You were formidable in Parliament for so long, and I hope you're enjoying a more peaceful retirement. Well,
Kate, that's very kind of you, and I'm sorry I banged on so much in the answers. I keep writing down next saying "shut up" to myself. I'm sorry. I banged on frightfully, but thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
You've been charming. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Nicholas Soames. Thank you.
Thank you.